everybody's going on Zoom and this is so new for people. She's like, I've been doing this forever. She goes, but I do worry people are going to go overboard, that they're going to sort of, even if they're extroverts, they're going to kind of OD on it.
Hey, it's E.B. Moss, and this is episode 3 of Insider Interviews. It's an interesting time right now, and I thought that called for an interesting guest. So I invited Erica Keswin. She's described as a workplace strategist, and she's a best-selling author on that topic, and she consults with major companies on improving their performance by improving their relationships. And everything right now is all about relationships, right? So I wanted to have her on as a guest right away because I was really intrigued after a webinar that she led for the Female Quotient recently on being human while working from home. Now, this podcast, Insider Interviews, is primarily geared towards people working in the media, marketing, and advertising business. But I wanted to talk to Erica because of the operative word, working. Everything about how we work now is different, no matter the industry. And everything a brand does in today's COVID-19 environment has to be looked at through a slightly different lens. Hey there.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me here in my bedroom.
You are welcome.
How is everyone where you are?
We're hanging in there. Online school started, so that's good. And we're just trying to get through day by day.
Yeah, I know. And, I just did a session on at-home technology, and I haven't figured it out completely. And this is my second attempt to do a remote interview. And you had to be incredibly patient as we got the Squadcast folks on the phone in real time. So we're just going to roll with it, Erica, and we're just going to be human. So
good to me.
So why don't we start with that? What do you mean in not only your book title, but all the work that you do by being human?
So if I had to boil it down to one sentence, I would say that being human means honoring relationships. And that could be honoring relationships with colleagues, with your boss, with the people that work for you, with your customers, your employees, and yourself. All of those, really looking at it from a holistic perspective. Are you honoring your relationships?
And that led you to write the book called Bring Your Human to Work.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's talk about that evolution. I mean, that seems like it might be the culmination of what you've worked towards. There's that work again.
Yeah. Well, if you talk to people who've known me, whether it was in grammar school, high school, business school, or as an adult, and say, what's the one word that you would all use to describe Erica? It would be that of a connector. So I've always been someone who's valued relationships. I've worked in executive recruiting, connecting great people to great jobs. I've been executive coach. My side hustle, I've set up 3 marriages, which is in the Jewish religion means I'm going straight to heaven.
You are.
I'll have that covered. So it's always been something that's been important to me. And in 1998, I was working as a recruiter and I got my first phone. It was a BlackBerry. And I don't know if you had a BlackBerry, but it was an awesome phone. It just had the best keyboard and I miss it to this day. And I was engaged to my now husband, Jeff. And he said, I have a conference in Bermuda. Do you want to come with me? And I said, well, I don't have any vacation days. I was saving them for our honeymoon. But I had this phone, this device, and I was able to go with him and work, truly work from the beach. And I said to myself out loud, this is the life. This is the best thing going. I feel so lucky. Mm-hmm. Fast forward, 10 years and a couple of different jobs and 3 kids later, the iPhone came out and I got an iPhone and I kept my BlackBerry. And while it was great, I began to see the impact that the technology was having on my relationships, some good and quite frankly, some not so good. And in contrast to that moment in Bermuda, again, I remember saying out loud to myself, like, I can't believe this is my life. What am I doing with these devices? And my kids were getting to be the age where they were saying, get off your phone, get off your phone. And so it was really looking at the juxtaposition of those two events to say, if this is impacting me in my life and I'm someone who really values relationships, what about everybody else? And I took that sort of aha moment and meshed it with my 20 years of experience in the human capital space and began to investigate the impact of technology on connection and relationships at work.
So I want to go back before we go forward and tell us a little bit about your experience in those 20 years. I mean, were you in scenarios where you did not feel treated like a human, where people around you were complaining? Because I know that you worked in a lot of HR roles and advisory roles and placement roles.
I would say it was more of what I was seeing as I walked into these organizations. People texting each other in the next cubicle.
Yeah.
The CEO shared a story with me that I often tell when I do my keynotes at companies. And true story that there was a conference call at his company, and he found out after the fact that all 9 called in from the same building. And so as I began to hear story after story, I said to myself, what's going on? What would make someone decide to forego the opportunity to connect with their colleagues face to face? And what I began to see through the research and my work, and you'll have to excuse the cheesy pun, but left to our own devices, we're not connecting. And I wanted to look at why, but also what was the impact to us as people, but also to our business.
So that seems like a clear path. And I know that social media only added to our challenge as we sort of became more virtual and started replacing person-to-person relationships with person-to-device relationships. So in your book, Bring Your Human to Work, you have like 10 ways where you can bring your human to work. And I know that we can't go through all 10 of them, but if it were my choice, I would. But with today's totally different work landscape, and given the fact that our audience has a lot of brand marketers and advertising folks listening, what are the top 3 or 4s that you can go over with us, both as any kind of organization? And then I also want to, part B, ask you what brands should be thinking about in their communications.
Mm-hmm. So there's 10 chapters, as you mentioned, and I love them all, my 10 children. And chapter 1 is first for a reason, and it's called Be Real, How to Speak in a Human Voice. And from a brand media advertising perspective, it's the number one thing that employees look for when they go work for a company, and that customers want when they engage with a brand, when they buy a product from a brand or a service from a brand, that brands need to be thinking about what are their values. And again, another sort of cheesy line, but to me it resonates, is, for listeners here that are brands, how do you get the values off the walls and into the halls? Having a bunch of platitudes sitting in a frame, like this is what we stand for, is not going to cut it in this new world of work. And especially with Gen Z and millennials, they're demanding something different. So the first part of this is know your values. One mistake that many brands make is that they have way too many, 10, 12, 14 values. Who can remember those? And it doesn't get you to really hone in on, what is the soul of your brand? What do you stand for? So the number that I feel works is 3 to 5. Sometimes I'll let people sneak by with 1 or 2 more, but chances are if you have 10 values and if you really look at them, my guess is there are some duplicates, and you have to begin to prioritize them. And the litmus test, how do you know if your values are alive and working or if they're sitting on the frame? I call it the fork in the road. So you're at the fork in the road, and should you take a left or take a right? Should you hire this person? Should you launch this commercial? Should you do this deal? I mean, all the different things that are in this industry, your values should help guide you. And if they're not, either they're the wrong ones or or you have too many and they are just not working. And so I would say from a brand perspective, it's more critical today than ever. The second thing I would say on this topic is you have to then speak in that human voice across all mediums of communication. And I talk about this from an internal employee perspective because, you want to retain your top people, and also from a consumer customer perspective. So think about communication along a continuum. You have instant message and text and Slack and email and picking up the phone. And we used to be able to walk across the hall, and we used to be able to get on trains and planes and visit people. So for now, let's just assume someday we will be able to do that again. What I see from a societal perspective is that many of us are defaulting to that technological end of the spectrum. And what I would urge you to do, especially, we're in the midst of this, COVID-19 quarantine, how can you, to your earlier question, honor relationships across all of these mediums? And if you're having a customer who hasn't really been in touch or seems off, or an employee, don't send the text. Pick up the phone, turn on the camera. And when we can, again, these, hopefully we'll get in front of people face to face. So know your values, speak in that human voice across all mediums of communication. And then the third thing that maybe we'll get into later is if we agree that left to our own devices, we're not doing this, what are some companies doing in terms of developing protocols to ensure that to the best of their abilities, they are honoring relationships?
So where do we start? And if you have to narrow down your values, and if you have to start communicating those values, what do we do differently and how do we start?
Well, first I would start with, if you have some on a piece of paper that you've started with, I would urge you to get, a group of people in a room. Typically starts with the senior management team, but then I would make sure that you bring in different generations and get their perspective as well on, does this, given where our business is today, do these values make sense? Some companies will send out a survey and try to get ones that resonate more. Like, figure out a way to get information and engage your employees in this process, and test it out with the litmus test that I talked about, to say, oh, we made this decision. Which one of these values does that fit with? Maybe I'll give an example or two and see if this is helpful. So the company Lyft has 4 values. They actually have very cool values, by the way. Uplift others is one. Create fearlessly is one. I've become, as my side hustle, sort of obsessed with values and how they sound and what they mean. So 2 examples within Lyft. One, when you go into their office in San Francisco, Logan Green, one of the co-founders, happens to be obsessed with Willy Wonka. And when you go in the office, there's a big picture of Willy Wonka on the door. And it's a room, this sort of secret yet not so secret room that's set up like a library. And you either are quiet in there or silent in there. And it's a physical manifestation of their value, create fearlessly. Because in today's workplace, many offices are completely open. And how can you create fearlessly if you can't think to get your work done? And so you also don't necessarily want everybody always working from home. Hopefully there is some value when we all get back to face. So that's one example. Another one, and this is something that any company can do, and I know many do this, but the point is to make it clear and intentional that it's linked to your values. So once a month, Lyft has an all hands meeting where they give recognition to somebody in the front office and the back office that has lived one of those values. So a driver and then somebody in the back office.
Right.
And they will pick a value and say, here is an example where someone has uplifted somewhere else. I can go into some of those stories, but really impactful, moving stories that can be shared with a small group or can be shared with the whole company to continue to reinforce how these values are alive and how they're appreciated and valued. And to your point, brands today need to have people feel connected on a human and emotional level, or they will leave and go somewhere else in terms of what they buy and in terms of where they want to work.
One of the things that you talk about is also mind your meetings. And you talk about the fact that a lot of companies, when in doubt, call a meeting. We've all worked in that, and they can be very ineffective. And now I feel like people are sort of going crazy with Zoom, which is great because we get to kind of connect in this new way. What advice do you have for conducting a meeting, whether it's through technology or when we're back in the office, and how do we stay connected through technology now?
I'll give some thoughts and maybe a caveat or two, just given the stress that everybody's under now, because I do think it adds something that we should be doing to our meetings. But whether it's pre or post COVID-19, the first thing I would say is the same. Make sure your meeting has a purpose. Do not have a meeting for the sake of having a meeting. And in the book, I talk about one of the co-founders of Warby Parker, who does sort of a post-mortem at the end of every week with his assistant about all the meetings that he had. Was this one worth it? Who was there? Was someone missing? Some people will say, why do you have the 11 a.m. meeting? Well, I've always had the 11 a.m. meeting. So if all of us sort of take stock in the meetings that we have and really ensure there's a purpose, my guess is we could all get rid of 20% of our meetings. So that's where I would start. And meetings are great. We all like to feel connected, but we also need to get work done. So that would be number one. I have in the book, I lay it out as the 3 Ps. So the first P is purpose. The second P is presence. And we need to be physically present, whether that's in person or on Zoom, but also psychologically present. And that, I think, especially now, is more important than ever, that we need to make sure and tell people. It kind of links in the third P, which are protocols. No cell phones, no multitasking. Maybe everybody stand up, because we need to be psychologically present. And that links to higher productivity, that if we're not constantly getting interrupted, our meetings will be shorter. One of the best practices that I've been talking about with companies since everybody's working from home is, before you jump in to your meeting, have a check-in, a personal check-in. How are you doing? And I was on the webinar that you listened to the other night.
Yeah.
A woman asked a really great question, which was, okay, let's say I'm on Zoom with 9 people and one person is just sucking the air out and taking up way too much time. And it gets tricky and people get emotional, and not all managers can deal with that. So again, it goes back to the third P, which are protocols. And you kick off your meeting and say, we're going to do a check-in. You know what? I'm going to have a timer. So you don't have to be the bad guy. You can just have this little timer with a nice chime that rings, and we move on to the next. And if you see someone that's having a really tough time, you can message them on the side saying that you'll follow up. So I do think that as we have these Zoom meetings, try to do some type of personal check-in. The last thing I'll say, and this is going to be more in my new book, which is about rituals. Rituals in meetings are an amazing way to tie what you're doing back to your values. I mean, again, another way to tie this into your earlier question, which was, how do you bring these values to life? There's a company called Notch, and they have a 4:30 show and tell meeting every week. And last week, they did it virtually for the first time. And so somebody showed pictures from a trip they took a month ago. They introduced 2 new hires. They talked about a new product that was coming out. And at the end, they had a forum where they could ask the CEO anything. And they could have just done that, and it was great. But what the head of HR did, which, not rocket science, doesn't cost anything, but you're going to forget if it's not intentional, is he said, we believe one of our values is transparency. And now more than ever before, we need to live these values and be transparent, which is why they added this session at the end of their all hands, it was called Ask Anda Anything, and Anda's the CEO. And so meetings are a great time to add in some of these rituals, try to start new rituals, and, which rituals are great at connecting employees to each other and to the brand.
So there's a difference between protocol and rituals, but it sounds like you want to make a ritual your protocol.
Well, right. You'd like to make a ritual your protocol, but what I would say, so how are they different, or how is a ritual different from a habit? Ritual is something that you do repetitively, and it's something that you assign almost a higher level of meaning to. So what you're doing goes beyond the practical nature of why you're doing it. And it almost creates, this magical element to it. And so ideally, you're right. You want your rituals to become a protocol, but you have to realize that rituals can't be force-fed. That I tell people that if you try to create a ritual, it might work, it might not. And if it doesn't stick, you move on. There are many rituals that'll be in the new book that were created by people that are no longer with the company, but the rituals have lived on. And sometimes we don't know why one's going to stick and one doesn't.
I know that one ritual that people are starting to adopt now is finding a way to connect back to the community and embrace wellness and things like that. Isn't that something that you also talk about in Bring Your Human to Work?
Well, it depends. It might be a ritual depending on what a company does, or it might not. So there's one chapter in the book all about well-being and why that's important at work. And now this isn't a ritual, but many companies, when we think about a brand, people are going to look back on this moment and say, how did this brand give back, and how did they show up in the midst of this pandemic? Again, whether it's for customers, whether it's for employees. And so many companies are offering mental health support to their employees. They're going out and they're figuring out ways to raise money. They're shutting down their factories are shut down anyway, but they're making masks. So those aren't rituals, but well-being and giving back are all parts of Bring Your Human to Work and having a human workplace. Now, giving back could be a ritual. One company, Zendesk, I do know they have a ritual where the first day of work, when someone comes to work there, is spent giving back in the community. So for them, that's a ritual. And one of the litmus tests that I use to figure out if something's a ritual, would it be just so crazy and weird and off if all of a sudden it was gone? And that's something that everybody at Zendesk, that's what happens when they start working. And all of a sudden, if you started and you didn't do that, people will say, I don't know what happened. Is somebody buying the company? This is who we are and this is what we do.
So it's really part of the fabric of the organization.
Or the team. Some of these rituals are within a team, within a department. They don't always have to be top down for the whole company, especially some, companies are huge.
And do you have either any examples or anecdotal evidence of how maintaining a human relationship and this connectivity, you've actually talked about the sweet spot between technology and communication and being human, but are there examples of how that has furthered the well-being of the company overall?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's so many. The one that's my favorite that I'll share, I found it when I was researching Bring Your Human to Work, and it comes out of Cornell University, and it was done by a guy named Kevin Niffen. And Kevin was studying team performance. What makes team A higher performing, more effective than team B? And his father was a firefighter, and so he grew up hanging out in the firehouses, and that's who he studied. And what he found was that the firefighters who were the most dedicated to the ritual of sitting around the table, having their firehouse meal, connecting as humans, building trust with their fellow firefighters, it correlated with higher performance, and those firefighters actually saved more lives. And
wow.
When we think about, there's so many other studies, whether it's even looking at the biggest health risk, pre-corona, but, one of the biggest health risks for all of us is loneliness and isolation. And that impact, and why do we talk about that at work? Well, many of us spend much more time at work than we do at home. And so we need to figure out ways to curate connection because it does impact our own personal performance, but for sure that of our business.
Well, two things on that. I now understand the origins of your company URL, the Spaghetti Project.
Right. I should have added that when I discovered that study and I began to interview firefighters and read about them and watch and read everything I could on them. the stereotypical go-to meal for a firefighter is spaghetti. And so my company and my work is called the Spaghetti Project. And I go into companies and give talks, and we channel our inner firefighter and we bring people together physically in a room. I'm actually doing one in a couple weeks on Zoom to talk about why we're not talking and to connect. Our oxytocin goes up, our feel-good hormone, stress, and our cortisol goes down, which we're all feeling right now as we're doing these Zoom calls.
So that is actually where I wanted to sort of wrap things up a little bit, is to get your expert recommendations on how we can eat more spaghetti together. How can we leverage technology right now so that we keep our cortisol in check, so that we maintain the health of our organizations and us as humans?
So, I'm thinking about something someone said to me the other day, who has always worked from home. And she said, everybody's going on Zoom and this is so new for people. She's like, I've been doing this forever. She goes, but I do worry people are going to go overboard, that they're going to sort of, even if they're extroverts, that they're going to kind of OD on it. Because I think the first week it was virtual happy hour and virtual this and I took virtual Pilates yesterday. And so I think it goes back to sort of where we started this conversation, and thinking about your business and your goals and your values and trying to figure out the way to match the message to the medium. And if you're a leader and you're listening to this, I would map it out on a piece of paper, especially right now when we're this is new, uncharted territory. So I'm just giving you my off the cuff answer here because I've never had to think about this
for all of us.
Real time, what I would say, and I like this question because I'm having to do it on the spot, which I would say to people, you know what? Think about all the things that need to get done in your group, in your organization, and say, if you're dealing with these kinds of issues, we're going to have a Zoom meeting. If you're dealing with this kind of a thing, we'll start it out on Slack. If we're doing this, maybe pick up the phone. And just thinking about all the different things you need to get done. And as you're dealing with certain issues, how and when do they get elevated to other mediums of communication? Because I don't think the answer, as much as we do get that burst of oxytocin from the Zoom, we cannot do it all day. I would also urge everybody, especially if you're running the meeting, to make sure that you say to your people, you need to take some time to turn it off. You need to take some time for self-care right now.
So important.
Getting all the work done, but making sure that pushing people, because people are stressed. They think they're going to be the next one to lose their job. And so it really is up to the leaders to model and to push people to make sure that they're taking care of themselves.
That was great. And I feel like we really connected, even though it took us a while to technically connect, Erica.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the spaghettiproject.com. We've talked about Bring Your Human to Work as one of your several books. Is there another destination that you want to point us to? Any upcoming webinars or sessions or anything that you're doing?
Yeah, so spaghettiproject.com, or even just my name, ericakeswin.com. People can find me. I would tell people to send me an email at erica@spaghettiproject.com. I have a PDF, a mini copy of the book, that if anybody listening wants one, they can email me and get it. I am doing, on my website, I have a bunch of different events that I'm doing over the next couple weeks. One that's really focused on employee engagement with Cy Wakeman and a number of other great people. And I'm pretty accessible. I'm pretty human. Find me on LinkedIn, follow me on Instagram. I'm trying to get more followers than my teenagers. I wish everybody good luck in this crazy time. And I guess the last thing I would just say is, from a brand perspective, how are you going to be remembered during this time in terms of, what you did, what you said, what you supported, and how you brought your human to work?
Perfect words. Erica, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, a little bit off the cuff and still brilliant. I hope you got some good inside scoop from this podcast. There's a lot more where this one came from. So please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you download your podcasts: Apple, Stitcher, TuneIn, Google Podcasts. You know the drill. I also want to thank Eric Klein for his excellent editing and my friend John Clayton for the fantastic theme music for Insider Interviews with E.B. Moss.